So yeah, thank you all so much for being here. It's especially exciting for me to be here in Goshen giving a presentation. One, because the boundaries between our various counties have changed greatly over the centuries. And actually, Goshen would have originally been really at the northern part of Orange County. Much of what we think of as northern Orange County today would have originally been Ulster County. And even for us all in our daily lives, right, county boundaries are relatively arbitrary. I grew up in Plattekill, pretty much right on the southern border of Ulster County. Most of my daily life was bouncing over that border. And I had been to, don't tell anyone in Ulster County I said this, but I had been to Newburgh probably 20 times as many times as I had been to Kingston prior to taking this job. So it's really rewarding for me to be here telling this story. Just a bit more about myself. I grew up, as I said, in Plattekill, just south of New Paltz. With family, I have always been deeply connected to local history. So my great uncle was one of the founders of historic Huguenot Street, what was the oldest historical society in New Paltz, founded in 1894. I grew up on a farm that had been in my family in Plattekill since 1898, 100 years before I was born. And yet I will be transparent with you all, I did not find local history particularly interesting growing up. I think in one sense because of those family connections. This is what my grandma and grandpa talk about when they want to talk about why they're important and why they're the most important people in New Paltz, right? And I actually studied Irish history, something very different in college. I studied abroad in Ireland, and I was actually working on grad school applications there. But I had the misfortune of studying abroad in Ireland in the spring of 2020. And so I was on the last plane out of the country. I ended up back here, and I thought, well, what am I going to do with this useless history degree now? And fortunately, a full-time position had opened up at Huguenot Street. And I had worked there as a tour guide at a time where they were beginning to work in stories that had previously been, I think, with some level of intention, left out of the narrative told there. Stories of not just enslaved people, but of Native Americans oftentimes as well. Even with the Europeans, they were oftentimes being selective in terms of who was most important and who should be celebrated. And I was able to take a full-time position there at a time where they were really looking to overhaul their narrative, to give equal attention to everybody that would have lived in New Paltz, from the poorest to the richest European, from the enslaved to the native people of that landscape. And it was in that moment that I really fell in love with local history, that I learned that it's just as exciting, just as engaging as any other area of history in the world, really, and that there is so much still to uncover. And so today's topic is going to be, in one sense, an overview of the earliest Dutch colonization of the Hudson Valley, but also in that overview, especially trying to give you guys insight into the history of enslavement here in New York. In that, I will be transparent with you all and ask for your forgiveness right up front, because most of the examples I'll be using are from Ulster County, just being my area of expertise. And also, maybe a little bit of bragging, to tell the story of Dutch colonization leading to the founding of a place like Dutchess County or Orange County, you kind of have to go through Ulster County because we're the oldest one. And so I ask you all to bear with me through these Ulster County examples as we go through, but really try and in your mind be thinking about, if I use an example of daily life of an enslaved person in New Paltz, that being an example indicating what daily life might have been like as well for an enslaved person here in Orange County.
Well, Ulster County wasn't far away.
No, it's still not far away. I drove over the border this morning. Cool, yeah. I love that.
The precinct of New Paltz came as far south as,
No.
you should interview or not?
Yeah, it went far south.
Deer Park.
Yeah, going north about to
My
Rosendale.
ancestor, Pierre de Moran.
Yeah, there was a huge, so New Paltz is 40,000 acres originally.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Wahakamok precinct was created out of New Paltz.
Absolutely.
It was also,
Yeah.
and we have slaves sometime.
Yeah, oh, cool. And we're going to get a lot of context for how these towns are expanded in the sequence there. And an image just to get us started showing what some of the earliest colonial communities in the Hudson Valley would have looked like. This is a painting done by the incredible historical painter Len Tantillo. Some of you might be already familiar with his work.
I know.
And he uses archival records and archaeological data to paint as accurately as possible scenes from the past. And so, for instance, this is the oldest phase of settlement of Europeans on what's now Huguenot Street in New Paltz. So all of the stone houses that make up the museum that's now there on Huguenot Street, this painting, the buildings you see in this painting predate those stone houses. It was a wooden fortification that we only know is there because of archival documents and archaeology. And so Len Tantillo has painted that. And actually most of our colonial towns start out with a stockade or a redoubt, a wooden fortification built around a more condensed village first. But so just an image to get us started. And I'm gonna ask a couple questions as we go through it too, just because I like, an engaged audience. So this picture on the left will kind of give it away. But if I were to ask you guys, for both Europeans and Native Americans, what would be drawing people to live on a specific set of land? What would have drawn Europeans to settle here in the first place? Does anyone have a guess? Yeah, what about the water? Somebody said it.
Well, waterfalls, you needed waterfalls.
Waterfalls somewhat. What did, I think you joined us at it.
Farming?
Farming.
Good land.
Exactly, yeah. So almost all of the native village sites in the Hudson Valley, and later most of the earliest European towns, are built on pretty much the same topographic layout. You'll have a raised plateau of land, a flat stretch of land, over top of a river that floods. And that raised stretch of land is needed because that's where you build your homes outside of the danger of the flooding. But then that river is not just providing you food in terms of, shellfish, in terms of, spawning fish in the spring. It's providing you food through the fertile soil it creates on its floodplain. So if you think about a place like New Paltz, Huguenot Street is on a plateau up above the Wallkill River, which floods every year. I took this picture on the left last year. I walked down from my apartment, I walked across the bridge in town, and you can see the flats there. They're still farmed to this day. And it's these floods that happen every year that make that such fertile farmland. And that farm has been farmed continuously for thousands of years. That farm has been farmed continuously with some of the same plants. It's likely corn's been grown there for about 1,500 years. It's very likely sunflowers have been grown there for 5,000 or more years on this same stretch of land. And so, in terms of where Europeans, where later white Americans are choosing to build their homes, it's closer, I think, to why Europeans are drawn to, or Native people are drawn to specific bits of land than you might expect. So in our map on the right, I always like to just start with kind of, environmental geography. What are the landscape features that draw people here? And it's rivers primarily. Both the Hudson River and what it allows in terms of transportation, for trade and communication, as well as what it allows for industry itself. You can get ice from it in the winter, you can fish in that river. But it's the really tributaries of the Hudson that draw people outward from the banks of the Hudson into interior towns. Places like Kingston, which is founded right in between the Esopus Creek and the Rondout, right where they flow into the Hudson, with a floodplain just like the one in New Paltz. The one in Kingston's a Hannaford parking lot now, though, that floodplain, so not as exciting as this one on the left. Hurley would be the same way. Most, if not all, of the oldest colonial towns are founded on floodplains here. And so I always like to start with this, just to get a sense of how the landscape influences really where we live up to the present day. And so I've already mentioned the native people of this landscape. Does anyone want to take a guess for me, or if you know the answer, want to say what the name of the native people of both Ulster and Orange County was? Yeah, Lenape. And there's a few right answers, so I kind of put that open like that. So Lenape is really a language. I heard somebody else say Munsee as well.
Yeah.
And so Lenape is what we today, what we linguistics, what historians refer to as the language spoken really from far western Connecticut, the Housatonic River Valley, through the Hudson River Valley in western Long Island, Manhattan, down through the upper Delaware and Susquehanna River Valley. So parts of northern New Jersey, parts of Pennsylvania, as well as these areas in New York and Connecticut. But Lenape is just what we call the language. Lenape just means human in their language. It's an Eastern Algonquian language, and that's a language family spoken all across North America. It actually originates in the Columbia River Plateau, what's now the state of Washington. Over thousands of years, their descendants moved east along what's now the border between the United States and Canada, and eventually came down from the Great Lakes region. And they end up settling here somewhere around 2,000 years ago. There are native people here for at least 10,000 years since the end of the last ice age. We still don't have a really clear picture of who those earliest residents are. But we know that the people that are here at the time of European contact, the Lenape, they end up here about 2,000 years ago. They push out the earlier residents, and there's still a lot of mystery there. But Lenape just means human being. So imagine the first Dutch explorers arrive. Imagine Henry Hudson coming up the river in 1609. He looks at these people, and he says, "Who are you?" And people look back at him and say, "No, I don't know. People? We're humans?" And we call them Lenape up to the present day. Many native tribes are known by their word for human being. And so within Lenape, there are multiple dialects spoken. There's a dialect spoken on the east side of the Hudson River by some of the groups you can see on this map. And this map on the right comes from a scholar named Tom Arndt Mitrod. And it shows all of the different subgroups of the Lenape here in the Hudson Valley. So even though these groups all spoke dialects of the same language, even though they all had similar cultures and they were allied with one another, they would intermarry with one another, they identified most closely with the land they specifically lived on, not unlike us today. And so they probably would have had specific identifiers if you were a Lenape person from what's now Goshen versus what's now Newburgh versus what's now New Paltz. And so the groups on the east side, you can see some of them here, like the Wappingers people, further north the Mohicans, they speak a dialect called Mohican. And their descendants today live in Wisconsin, in a federally recognized tribe. There is a dialect spoken far to the south in the Delaware and Susquehanna River valleys that is called Unami, and their descendants today live in 2 tribes in Oklahoma. But here, so on the west side of the Hudson, from the Catskills down through Newburgh, really down south, right to the border with New Jersey today, and through Manhattan, western Long Island, spoke a dialect called Muncie. And that's really what we call the dialect today, is Muncie. And so specifically, there was a group living from about halfway up the Catskill Mountains down to about what's now Newburgh that were called the Esopus people. And just to their south were a group that later come to be known as the Highland Indians. They're very closely related to the Esopus, they're intermarrying. A lot of people share a common identity between the Esopus and the Highland Indians. The Highland Indians would likely be living here. They spoke the same dialect, Muncie. We're kind of on a border region here in Goshen. A little bit to our southwest would be another group, the Minnesinks, you can see there. That's actually where the word Muncie comes from. It's from the word Minnesink. They have a similar origin. But these are all interrelated groups. And their way of life was entirely built around this landscape. You can see on the left another painting by Len Tantoa, God bless him, of a scene of a native village site here on a small tributary river of the Hudson. And this image is specifically demonstrating family dynamics among the Lenape. So their way of life was entirely built around this land. And they viewed themselves as one part of an interconnected environment in which everything is equally sentient and equally important to the sustenance of the environment. Really, the issue is not that things aren't sentient, the issue is communication. Just because my language that I speak with other humans isn't the same language that the dogs are speaking to each other, and isn't the same language that the rocks are speaking to each other, doesn't mean that they're not speaking to one another and thinking. And they probably think that I'm not thinking, and they probably think that we can't speak. And man, wouldn't it be very, kind of conceited of us to assume that we're the only intelligent beings in the universe? And so they know they have to take plant and environmental materials to survive, but they view themselves as one part of this interconnected ecosystem in which they have to provide for others, in which they have to steward the land as well. And to this day, we can see those stewardship practices. If you map out the treescape, if you map out the percentage of what trees are in different areas of the Hudson Valley, the areas that have the highest percentages of fire-resistant tree species are always the areas that have a native village within 10 miles of them. Right up to the present day, we can see the effect that native people have on the environment. They're using fire to manage the environment, to create open lands that they can farm, and to bring in fire-resistant species that bear beneficial foods like fruit and nuts especially. And so it's just a cool example of how they view and interact with the environment. A bit different from European cultures, they were matrilineal, so family is always traced down to the female line. They had clans, and your group and clan identifier was inherited from your mother. But they also had a concept of land ownership, a concept of decentralized land ownership, really land access might be a better way to put it, and you would inherit that from both parents. So, and I should mention, your parents had to be from different groups. So if you were a Wappingers native person from the east side of the Hudson, you could not marry another Wappingers person. You had to marry a Mohican person or a Muncie person, an Esopus person. And so you would inherit land rights still from your parent. And so even if you're an Esopus person in New Paltz, you very well could have land rights down here in Goshen because your father might have been a Highland Indian, let's say. And they did not have a written language as well. So all of their history, going back thousands of years, which was remarkably accurate, that history was recorded and passed on through storytelling, really, through oral histories. And that's what this is showing us on the left. It's showing us a grandfather telling an oral history to a group of children in a village here. And just to show some artifacts quickly talking about the native people. So on the top left, you can see what is called a wigwam. And that is specifically a wigwam that was reconstructed on Huguenot Street in New Paltz about 2017. Much like Lenape just means human, wigwam just means house in Lenape. They also lived in longhouses, what we might be more familiar with. And longhouses tend to be more ubiquitous with the other large native group in New York, the Haudenosaunee. I always like to mention, and I should have mentioned this earlier, that the Lenape are one of 2 language groups here in New York. The other is the Haudenosaunee, what we used to call the Iroquois. Their languages are as different from one another as they are from English. They actually were ancient enemies. But they share some cultural commonalities, like the use of longhouses. But just as often as longhouses, we see Esopus people, I should say, Lenape people in general, living in single-family homes called wigwams. And this wigwam was built accurately in collaboration with the native nations today, the Lenape nations. It's built entirely out of plant materials found within a few miles of Huguenot Street. So imagine they could go out into the environment around them and they could build a semi-permanent home from those materials. And that wigwam was actually reconstructed on the exact site of where we know there was a wigwam in the 16th century. Right down to the dimensions of that wigwam are identical to the dimensions of one that stood on that exact site. And it's right where Huguenot Street is founded. It's right where the Europeans decided to build their first homes in New Paltz. So very often, native village sites become our European village sites afterward. I could go on all day about the technological advancements of this wigwam. I mean, they understand the technology of the environment to a degree that I would say we still don't in the present day. And we might hear, right, they're building their homes out of plant materials. That looks like a hut to me. They must not be advanced. It's really quite the opposite. So they're using bark on the outside, tulip and elm bark, that is layered like shingles to allow the water to flow off. We can tell where the wigwam was because the post holes, so there's cedar saplings, and there's, if you see in the bottom left, that's an interior view. You can see there's a frame identical to the outer frame on the inside. And there's cedar saplings that are cut while green, they're soaked so they can be bent, then they're dried into shape. They're lashed together with wet strips of basswood bark, which itself dries in shape, and then you can't move it. And they're burnt at the bottoms. Burnt so much that they won't rot, but not burnt so much that they'll lose their structural integrity. And they're inserted about 1.5 feet deep into the ground. And that's how we can tell where they are when we dig down into the ground. We can find the holes with discolored dirt and with ash deposits of where these posts were. And if you look on the inside, the bottom left, it's kind of dark so you can't see it well, but the walls are woven with hollow reed grasses, about 6 inches thick in the walls and about 1 foot thick on the roof. Why hollow? What's that going to do? Does anyone have a guess? Exactly. And so they have thousands, tens of thousands of micro pockets of air woven together in the walls, 6 inches thick. The stone houses built by our wonderful European ancestors did not have insulation. If you were here in 1750, in the height of the winter, that would be a more comfortable and a warmer home, easier to heat than a stone house would be. It's incredible. Now, fire has another benefit. There is a smoke hole you'll see in the top and the bottom left. So that smoke hole, I mean, it's not going to let all the smoke out at once. It's going to get really smoky in there with the fire going. And that was intentional. They knew that smoke had antimicrobial properties, that it was antifungal, and they knew that if they let the creosote, the chemical in ash, deposit on the walls of the wigwam, it would stop it from decomposing. I mean, you guys, it might have even slipped past you, but I said that was built in 2017 of plant materials, and it's standing in the same spot today. If we made a pile of those plant materials and just left them in the lawn outside for 8 years, they're going to be rotten within a year. So it's incredible technological advancement. And they would live in those village sites mainly, so the elderly people would live there for the full year, some of the young folks. But they would move around quite often. So they would move their homes maybe every decade or so, rotating crop fields, burning new fields. But they would move even seasonally. The men and the kind of women in the prime of their lives from the community would be going to the river in the spring. They would be traveling to the Hudson or maybe even down to the Long Island Sound. They're getting shellfish there. They're trading with other native people there. They're getting sturgeon from the Hudson to bring back to their interior settlements. And then they would be going to camps in uplands in places like the Shangum Ridgeline, which comes right down through here as well, places like the Catskill Mountains, in order to hunt each winter. And we still find hunting shelters today. So this in the bottom center, this is a rock shelter at Lake Minnewaska State Park. This is a rock overhang, it's like a mini cave, in which archaeological artifacts have been found, showing us that native people would temporarily camp there every winter as they hunted in the uplands in the Shango Mountains. In the top you can see a archaeological artifact. That's a bowl from a Lenape tobacco pipe. So I mentioned that they view themselves as one part of this interconnected environment, but they can't communicate with the environment. That's where tobacco comes in. So tobacco is a spiritual medicine in their community, and it still is used that way today. They believe that tobacco burning kind of bridges the gap between your world, the natural environment, and the spirit world. So they have many stories, for instance, where an individual wants to talk to an owl, and they light tobacco under a tree where the owl is, and suddenly they can speak to one another. In the top right, you have a fragment, a shard of a Lenape ceramic, a Lenape pottery piece. That motif on that pottery is called Kingston Incise. And when we find that motif, when archaeologists find it, I should say, they're able to tell that that's an Esopus pottery piece. just based on the design element that was unique to the people of what's now Ulster in northern Orange County. In the bottom right, those are net sinkers that were found in the Wallkill River from fishing every spring, catching spawning fish. And so I mentioned, right, their way of life is built around the environment. If you throw any large disruption into that environment, it's going to disrupt their way of life. And that's what happens with the onset of colonization. But I find that people sometimes have this idea that the Europeans come here and their goal immediately is to get rid of the native people. And here in New York especially, that's not the case. The Dutch are drawn here because of native people. Because at this point there is and we're talking kind of the first half of the 1600s, there is an incredible demand for furs in Europe. And so trading with native people for furs is really the whole reason Europeans end up here in what's now New York. And it's the Dutch that are colonizing here from 1609 onward. And it's that fur trade is much of the reason why, maybe unexpectedly, the first large settlement founded here in what's now New York is not New York City, it's Albany. And it's because Albany is going to allow you to trade not just with all the Lenape people, but also with all of the Haudenosaunee people. Because you're at the confluence of the Mohawk and Hudson rivers, and the Mohawk River flows from the west from the Iroquois homelands. And so if you're the Dutch, you set up there, you're trading with everybody, and you're having a grand time. And New York City follows not long afterward in the 1620s as well. The earliest settlement, the earliest colonial settlement in the Hudson Valley, comes maybe about 25 years later. So it's Henry Hudson explores the river in 1609. You have the earliest settlements in Albany and New York City in the 1620s. And really it's about 1650, you have the first European settler in the mid-Hudson Valley, really the Hudson Valley as a whole, and they end up where Catskill is today. It's not necessarily like a village there. It's really just one settler there in what's now Catskill, and it later becomes a village. And so, Kingston is the first town founded in what's now Ulster County, and it's really the first large settlement founded here in the Hudson Valley from Greene County down through Orange County. And it's founded in 1652 when a man named Thomas Chambers, who had been living in Troy or Schenectady, I can't remember exactly which, but he's living in the Albany area. And there he is, finding he doesn't have a great deal of social mobility. He is stuck in a system where he's forced to rent land from some of the wealthiest families there, and he gets tired of this. And he negotiates with a group of Esopus people to get permission to buy land and settle on that land along the floodplain of the Esopus Creek, just north of what's now the Stockade District in Uptown Kingston. And so they did have a concept of land ownership, as I mentioned, and they do, at this point, especially by the 1650s, they're intermarried with the groups in New York City and Albany. They're very close relatives. They're trading with each other every year. So they know how land deals are working by the 1650s. The groups in New York City and Albany would have had to figure that out much more difficultly. But the groups here, by the time Europeans end up here, they're kind of familiar with Europeans. They're familiar with their concept of land ownership. And tensions immediately arise. I think it's incredible that the Esopus even decide we're going to take a peaceful approach. We'll give you permission to settle here. They try and coexist. But I think it's kind of natural that tensions arise. I don't necessarily blame either side. Think about just all the different ways tensions could arise. There are cultural misunderstandings, or things like alcohol. Native people have never consumed this substance before. They now get access to it, and we all know, right? Consumption of large amounts of alcohol can cause antisocial activity. There's cultural misunderstandings over the environment and over agricultural practices. Native people grow crops among one another that support one another, not in neat rows in crop fields. Europeans have large livestock, and at times those livestock are grazing in native cornfields, and that causes huge uproar. There's cultural misunderstanding, or there's tension over environmental degradation, right? The native people depend on this environment, they depend on the game of this environment. These Europeans come in with very different environmental stewardship practices, over hunting, for instance, and that causes problems for the Lenape way of life. Disease is the one we've all heard of though, right? Disease almost immediately begins taking a toll on their population. And this leads to 2 wars fought here. And really, before those wars are even fought, in 1657, the Dutch can kind of see the writing on the wall. And the Dutch governor, a man named Peter Stuyvesant, he writes to the colonists in what's now Kingston, and at this point they're living in a dispersed pattern, maybe 25 families, or 25 people, a dispersed pattern along the Esopus Creek. And he orders them to relocate their homes into the Stockade District, what we now call the Stockade District of Kingston. He orders them to move their homes to uplands above that floodplain and build a wooden fortification around it for protection. And it's that moment that what's now the city of Kingston is really founded. And you can see a painting by Land Tentilla of that stockade district, what's now the Uptown Kingston, on the right side here. And it's just a couple short years later in which a war breaks out in that town. It really breaks out actually just on the outside, purely over cultural misunderstandings. It's at the height of tension, and there's a European man who, him and a group of people come across a group of native people who are, they are inebriated around a campfire. We don't know exactly what occurs, but in that moment there's a disagreement that leads to an attack on those native people. The First Esopus War, we call it, only takes place in 1659. It's a relatively quick conflict. It's devastating to both sides, don't get me wrong, but it ends with both sides committing to an uneasy truce, but without resolving any of these tensions. You still have more Europeans moving in, and actually a number of native men are temporarily sent down to Curacao into enslavement, almost as hostages. They eventually do come back, but you can imagine that is not going to contribute to mediation of this conflict. And so in the years after the First Esopus War, the two sides try and return to being allies. Eventually, they're even letting the Esopus back into the walled city of Kingston to trade. But tensions are still rising. There's a couple isolated skirmishes that break out, and it's in 1663. At this point, a second town here on the west side of the Hudson had been founded, just to the south of Kingston. They called Kingston at first Esopus, which has a kind of common Dutch and native origin. Esopus, is not dissimilar from a Dutch word for river or creek, but it also comes from the Lenape word for small river or creek. So it's a cool word because it kind of ties into a commonality of the sound between both languages. And yeah, I don't know if that was a bit of an aside. But in 1663, a group of Esopus people are in the walled village of Kingston trading. And they're also visiting the second village, that's why I mentioned the name, which was called Nieuwdorp in Dutch, which means new village. We call that village Hurley today. And they are in both villages trading when we only get records from the perspective of the people in Kingston, but I mean, it's a cinematic and terrifying moment. I mean, imagine you're there in Uptown Kingston, right? There's a native person, you're trading with them, you likely have trade relations with them often. You might be buying furs from them, food from them, they've hunted, you might be selling back metal kettles, maybe a gun, maybe axes and tools. And at this moment, a rider covered in soot, his clothes tattered, bleeding, rides up to one of the gates of Kingston. You can imagine maybe this gate in the southwest here in this image. As he rides up to that gate, he's screaming in Dutch, the Indians have burnt the new village, the Indians have burnt the new village, the Indians have burnt the new village. And there's a moment of silence. And imagine you're that person, you turn and you look at the native person next to you. And in that moment, the native people draw tomahawks and pistols, and they begin mowing down people on the streets of what's now Uptown Kingston. So a number of men, women, and children are killed in that moment. A number of native people are killed in that ambush. Hurley is almost entirely destroyed. Kingston would have burned to the ground if not for a change in the wind that blows the fire away from the center of the village back towards the village walls. We still have ash that we find in archaeological digs from this attack. And a number, dozens of women and children are taken captive, taken hostage by the Esopus. And with an attempt likely at forcibly adopting them in their tribe to replace casualties in the previous conflict. So they are brought away from this village, and a Dutch militia is sent up to Kingston. We have surviving, you can find it online if you look it up. You look up diary or journal of the Esopus War, the Second Esopus War. We have a diary of the militia leader, a man named Martin Krieger. And we have his diary documenting how they are trying to get intelligence on where the captives were taken, as they're trying to use other native groups like the Mohicans to negotiate with them. And eventually, both a European woman escapes, actually the woman that lives in the house that I run as a museum in Kingston today. She escapes, and with her help and the help of a few native allies, they're able to find that village site, or this fort that the Esopus had fled to. You ask 10 historians, they'll argue for 2 hours about where that fort was. I don't take a stance, we don't entirely know. It's somewhere in the Shango Mountains. But they send, yeah, that's one of the stances. I've heard Carroxton, I've heard Pine Bush, I've heard Ellenville, I've heard everywhere, so I'm gonna just push on. But they send that militia down, and they're able to burn that fortification and return the captives at the end of that conflict. And they do the most incredible thing afterward. Because neither side loses, really, right? Both sides are here, neither side really wins either. And it's really brutal warfare. I've already mentioned women and children killed on both sides. You have both sides taking captives. You have both sides trying to burn each other's crop fields as winter approaches to starve out the other. They're trying to burn each other's homes to leave them shelterless and foodless as the winter approaches. And I think the most incredible thing happens at the end of that war. They don't sign a peace treaty just saying we're going to stop fighting. They sign a peace treaty in 1665, and this is, at this point, not the Dutch. Right when that conflict ends, the English take over the colony. And so the English are now in control of a colony that's mostly culturally Dutch. Really has all manner of different kind of Europeans living here. It was already an incredibly diverse place. You have Jewish people in New Amsterdam from the 1630s. You have a man who we know is from North Africa and owned a Quran living in New York City in the 1630s, which I think is important for us to acknowledge today, right? Our vice president said not long ago that he thinks your Americanness should be defined by whether or not your ancestors fought in the American Revolution or not. And I think that a lot of people with that mindset might assume that an individual of the Islamic faith couldn't have had ancestors fighting in the revolution. Well, there were people of the Islamic faith here far before J.D. Vance's ancestors were here. I don't know how we feel about that. And so it's incredibly diverse. You have French settlers in what's now New Paltz. You have German settlers in what's now Greene County. And then you have, of course, with the expansion of these colonies, the expansion of enslavement. And I mention that at this point because the first record we have of a black person in the western half of the mid-Hudson Valley, the west side of the Hudson River, is in the casualty list from that attack I just described. So we know they're here from the founding of Kingston. It's not just anyone's enslaved person. In the list of casualties, they say the enslavement of Thomas Chambers. And if you remember, I said that was the first person to buy land and settle in Kingston. There's every bit of likelihood, but we don't know for certain, every bit of likelihood that the moment a white man stepped foot on what's now the land in Kingston, a black man was next to him and founded that community just as much. But again, the records we have are too often incomplete. We have to think about, in the system of enslavement, who are creating the records that are going to describe enslaved people. It's not the enslaved themselves most often, it's the enslaver. And then who's going to preserve that record? Well, the earliest historical societies are almost often, white organizations, almost always. They have to then decide to preserve that document if it survives. And then that has to be intentionally preserved all the way up to the present. And even if it does survive, it's going to have relatively dehumanizing language that's not going to give us a full picture of that human. And that's why our earliest record of an enslaved person is in a list of casualties. And it just says the Negro of Thomas Chambers. But in the aftermath of that conflict, the English have taken over. Both sides sign a peace treaty that says not just we're going to stop fighting, it says we are going to commit ourselves to be allies, supportive of one another forever. And it says we're going to renew this treaty every single year. And every time we do a renewal, we're going to bring the youngest people from our community so that they can learn over years the importance of this treaty, of this alliance. And so that when we are gone one day, our children would carry this onward. And they do dozens of renewals between 1665, the last renewal, and you're going to get some foreshadowing here. The last renewal is in 1776. And there has not been a legitimate treaty renewal of the Nicholas Treaty between the Ulster County government and the Esopus people since 1776. You can see images of that peace treaty here on the left and right hand side. I am blessed to have this in the Ulster County archives. This is one door away from where I work. And at one of those treaty renewals, they present really, the most sacred object to the government of Ulster County. You can see in the top of the middle, that is an image of the original. On the bottom, you can see scans of a replica, just showing you what it originally looked like. Does anyone know what that is?
Seashells.
Yeah, it's a wampum bell, made of seashells. And so wampum are shells made of, they're beads made of oyster shells, white and purple beads. And they would be traded on strings. They were used, especially when Europeans come as currency oftentimes. But they were woven into belts. And these belts were one way for us to think of them might be like a mnemonic tool. They didn't have a written language. And so these belts would be created with designs, just specific symbols that would have represented meaning. And they would have been created to represent a specific event or a specific story or a specific agreement. And they would have been given in symbolism of that event or agreement so that when that story gets retold later, that belt gets brought out and they talk through the symbols on the belt. And then it could be carried forward by the next generation to tell that story and remember it. Unfortunately, the meaning of this belt has been lost. I can speculate a bit at the end if anyone would like me to. But we do still have this original wampum belt in the Ulster County archives today. But so neither side really loses. They're not committed to being allies. But you can imagine the Esopus are in an incredibly tough position. You've lost a ton of population. More and more Europeans are coming. And the Europeans lose a ton of population in this conflict too. The difference is that there aren't more Lenape people across an ocean who can come over here, right? The Europeans, well, more of them just come. And so the Lenape do, I think, something incredible, but something that we might look at very differently depending on the framing. They begin selling their land. And they sell their land in what's now the western side of the Hudson Valley in over 100 land deeds between 1660 and 1760. And they do it in over 100 deeds for a very specific reason. You're not selling all of your land in one foul swoop. You're intentionally selling bits of land that you want to sell for some strategic reason. And in doing those land sales, you're getting back goods that are helpful in sustaining your population in the aftermath of this devastation. And I'll use New Paltz as an example because it's one I'm most familiar with. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you can use a ton of examples, but yeah, kettles are a great example. Yep. And so in New Paltz, we don't know entirely why, but we do have a document that tells us that at one point at a treaty renewal meeting, Louis de Boyce, a French-speaking refugee from Belgium, he approaches the Dutch governor along with a Esopus man named Matsese, and he says to the English governor, me and Matsese have come to an agreement for me and 11 of my family members and colleagues to buy land to the south of us. And the English governor says, where do you get off negotiating with the native people without my permission? And Louis de Boyce throws his hands up and says, listen, me and this guy have known each other for like a decade. We've been trading together for like a decade, and every time we hang out, he's trying to convince me to do this. And I finally gave in, but I didn't force this on him. And what we get right there is a bit of insight. I'm going to speculate now, but we can speculate on why Matsese might have done that. I mean, imagine if his family specifically had taken the most losses in the Esopus Wars. Or imagine if the Z's had taken an especially large toll on his family in the aftermath of those wars. But imagine if the family living just over the Shango Mountains in the Rondout Valley had not lost as many family members. And they're struggling to feed themselves and defend themselves. Well, if you sell the land in New Paltz that's now depopulated, you give permission for Europeans to expand there, knowing there will be a mountain in between the Rondout Valley where you might move to live with your family, and the new European settlement, so a degree of separation there, you're going to get things like copper kettles, you're going to get things like adzes, axes, linen clothing, pots and pans, blankets, muskets, horses, but they make sure the horses are castrated so they can't breed the horses. But you can see kind of what some of the strategizing goes into these land sales. And I think too often we talk about these land sales as, the Esopus being helpless victims, instead of talking about this being an exercise of their agency when put in an incredibly difficult position. And so you can see on the top right there an image of the New Paltz Land Agreement. It's one of the earliest ones signed after these conflicts, the second earliest. The next one is Shango, in Marbletown actually, so the third. And in the aftermath of the 1677 Land Agreement, you have a village founded on a previous Lenape village site that we now call Huguenot Street. And it would be a very similar narrative for almost every European town. And so just picture, right, almost like epicenters or nodes, where if Kingston is the kind of epicenter of settlement, they're going to expand along waterways outward from there. Right? They're going to go along the Esopus Creek into the Esopus Valley, eventually up into the Catskills. They're going to go in the other direction with the Esopus up to what's now Sawgrady's. They're going to follow the Wallkill down through the Walker River Valley, and they're going to end up here eventually. I love driving from where I grew up to Goshen because I drive across the same river like 7 times on the drive. It's an incredible thing. You're going to continue along the Rondout Valley and along that waterway. And this is really the pattern by which European expansion occurs. And as I mentioned earlier, along with that European expansion, you have the expansion of enslavement. And too often we do not have records of the earliest generations of enslaved people. And we have to just, be content with knowing that there's a high likelihood they're there, even if we don't have a document telling us they're there. And so, for example, in New Paltz, this is the earliest surviving original document showing a person of color in New Paltz. There was one earlier one. So this is a receipt, and I'll talk more about this, but it's the receipt for a payment regarding ownership of an enslaved man named Jack, an enslaved African man named Jack. We do have one document earlier that shows us the families of New Paltz buying Jack from New York City, but it's only a translation. We do not know where the original document ended up. We just have a translation that survives. So this is the oldest original document. And this is demonstrating for us 2 things I think are really important when discussing enslavement in the Americas as a whole. Because I'll talk about enslavement oftentimes, and people will oftentimes shoot back at me, yeah, but enslavement happened everywhere in human history. Which is true, right? That's true. But I think in one sense that doesn't mean it's not important to talk about here. Why is it that we're comfortable talking about slavery in Rome, but the second I bring up slavery here, sometimes there's a degree of pushback? But there are also things that make enslavement in North and South America unique in human history. really you'll hear kind of two you hear academics use two characteristics very often. They're referring to enslavement here as racialized chattel slavery. And the first characteristic you can probably all figure out right there. We don't have a concept of race as we now know it until the 16th century, maybe the late 15th century. Humans have existed anatomically the same as they are today for 200,000 years. If you traveled 199,000 years into the past in a time machine, you kidnapped a newborn baby, you brought them to the present, and you raised that baby like any other kid today, by the time they were my age, you would not be able to tell any difference between that kid and another kid that was born in this day and age. And yet it's only for about 500 years we've had a concept of race. So this is an artificial concept we have. The idea that people with a specific skin color from a specific continent or a specific race that are at all different from people in other parts of the world, and that then subsequently means that they are somehow inferior, and that they are the only people that could be enslaved, that's an entirely artificial concept that is really, really, really new in human history. And that's one aspect. And in much of human history, it didn't matter who you were to be enslaved, right? You could be enslaved in, let's use the Roman Empire. You could be Irish, you could be Egyptian, you could be Middle Eastern, and you could be enslaved in Rome. The second characteristic is called chattel enslavement. And that refers specifically to the dynamic of ownership. Because in many parts of human history, they had enslavement, but those enslaved people were recognized as human beings that were enslaved, meaning they had certain rights. Their humanity was at times recognized. And I'll actually use the Dutch colony here as an example. Because under Dutch colonization here, up to 1664, the system of enslavement here is racialized, but it's only partially chattel enslavement. Enslaved people under the Dutch system had the right to appear in court. They had standing in court. They had the right to sue for their children, and mothers had the right to live with and to have some degree of say over the care and the daily life of their children. After a certain number of years, enslaved people under the Dutch system could expect to be able to sue for their freedom. And these are all things that are non-existent under the English system of enslavement, which is implemented here after the English take over. This is the idea that enslaved people are purely property. When we see them listed in inventory, let's say that somebody dies without a will, and they have to make a full inventory of their property in colonial times here. We don't see enslaved people listed alongside indentured servants or alongside workers or apprentices. We see them listed alongside livestock. I have a document in my mind right now that's a New Paltz that if anyone's interested I can show you. Actually, I might have it later in this presentation. There are three columns. There's a column that's memoranda of cattle, there's a column that's memoranda of swine, and there's a column that's memorandum of Negroes, it's random. And it's these two aspects combined that make enslavement in North and South America unique in human history and how it's been practiced in the last 500 years. And this is important as we think about what daily life would then be like for these enslaved people, right? Because this is going to greatly shape their way of life. And the documents we're going to see are going to reflect this level of dehumanization, they're going to reflect this racialization. So you can see this document, I mentioned already, so this man Jack, he had been as the first black resident of New Paltz. New Paltz is settled in 1678, and in 1680, one of the founders, Christian Deo, purchases an enslaved man named Jack from a doctor in New York City named Hartman Wessels. Hartman Wessels was selling Jack because he hadn't paid his rent in a year and a half, and his landlord was suing him for unpaid rent, and he needed a lot of money. And so he sells Jack for about half of the back pay of rent that he owes, which is fascinating. And this is a document from about 9 years later. Christian Deo by this point has died, and in his will, he writes, doesn't reference an enslaved person, but he writes in his will that all of his properties to be left divided equally among his children. So you might all think then, well, what does that mean for the person he enslaves, right? That's just like any other object, right? You can have partial ownership of a house, you can have two people that own the same land, you can have multiple people that own the same human being. And so this document is showing us Christian Deo's son, Pierre Deo, paying his brother-in-law, Abraham Du Bois, for his share of ownership of this enslaved man, Jack. I mean, it was the founder, one of the founders of New Paltz, I would argue. Yeah, and so I could pause for a moment and just give a bit of sense of the impact that these individuals would have. I'm gonna go back a little bit. So in this painting, right, as New Paltz is first being founded, and I'm just using this as an example, you can imagine, right, use this as a kind of case study to imagine the same impacts being had in a place like Goshen, in a place like Newburgh. The enslaved people, I mean, their skills are going to be directly contributing to the formation of a town. It's kind of the inherent contradiction of enslavement here. The system is built on denial of these people's humanity, and yet the most effective enslaved people that are going to make the most profit for an enslaver are going to be the most human enslaved people, if that makes sense. And so I'll explain what I mean by that a little bit more. One bit of work that enslaved people, or enslaved men are doing very often is farm labor, right? Or they might be working on a sawmill. Well, you can't just farm without knowing how to farm. You can't exactly just teach yourself how to do that either. And you can imagine someone that's very bad at farming is not going to be a particularly profitable enslaved person. Now, somebody who deeply understands the environment, deeply understands farming practices, and is a fantastically talented botanist and horticulturalist, that's going to be the most successful and profitable enslaved person for the enslaver. That's an inherently human skill. It's very similar for enslaved women, right? Imagine the work that they're doing, things like cooking, things like making linen clothing, things like childcare. Well, I mean, that cooking, that takes a great deal of skill and creativity. To take the ingredients that Jack might have grown and to craft them into something sustainable, something enjoyable for the other families there. Childcare, right? I mean, imagine the wisdom, imagine the caring that you need in order to successfully raise a child as a good human. Think about, right, I mentioned linen clothing. You give me a Lego set with directions and I'm gonna mess it up. Right? Some of you might knit or crochet and you would be the best people to really imagine the skills and the practice that goes into that. And now what happens if I mess up a meal that I'm cooking, right? I eat a crappy lunch. What happens if you're an enslaved woman and you mess up a meal that you're cooking? You can start to get a sense of just how harrowing daily life would be. I like to try and empathize and get over the lack of written documents we have by trying to imagine sensory experiences. I often will ask elementary school classes when I'm talking about this if kids have ever cooked on a fire, and the kids always say no. And I'm always like, you've never roasted a marshmallow. But imagine, right, we've all sat around a campfire. You've all had smoke go in your face. Think of the singe you feel in your nostrils. Think of the pain you feel when you breathe in that smoke. And imagine leaning over a 10-foot wide open hearth in an unvented cellar kitchen of a stone house in the heat of August, cooking over that hearth fire for a family of 12, 3 times a day, who aren't paying you and who are incarcerating you in that room. I have taught about this to thousands of people, and I am no closer to wrapping my mind around what that experience would truly be like. It's hard to fathom. And I think that I'm coming to an important point to mention as well, and that's a bit of the distribution we see of enslavement. Because we do see enslavement, it's no less brutal or inhumane in the North compared to the South. But I will often say to people, it is different in implementation and distribution. I'm going to skip ahead a few documents right now quickly just to get to what I want to talk about. So in this document on the left, this is a 1755 census of enslaved people. This was taken all throughout New York. Thank God this survives to the present day. It's the first comprehensive record of enslaved people. Sometimes these censuses would have the names of enslaved people. It was really up to the overseer of the poor, the official in each town, who was tasked with recording the enslaved people, whether or not to include their names. The man for New Paltz is a direct ancestor of mine. I think about this very often. But you can see there are, in this document, about 21 enslavers, and they're owning an average of 1 to 3 enslaved people per person. So down south, you actually have a smaller cross-section of the white population that own slaves, but they are owning far more enslaved people per person. And those enslaved people tend to be living in a very set economic model. Enslavement is implemented in a common economic model down south, right? It's a plantation, we've all learned about that. And so it's men and women living in separate structures, dozens if not hundreds of enslaved people, working on agricultural tasks kind of sun up to sundown. Here it's very, very, very different, especially in New York. And I should mention, New York is really the epicenter of enslavement in the North. We are the most enslaved colony and state in the Northeast. People are often shocked to hear this. In 1800, the second US federal census, there are more slave owners in the state of New York than there were slave owners in Virginia or Georgia. In 1800, more slave owners in New York than Virginia or Georgia. But they own far fewer enslaved people per person. And what that means, it's going to have a huge impact on daily life of the enslaved person, because they're not following this set economic model. If your enslaver owns a sawmill, you're working on that sawmill. If your enslaver is an agriculturalist, you're working in the fields all day. You're living with 1 to 3 people, not in separate structures, but most often you're living in cellar and attic spaces. And that's why I described that cellar kitchen. That was where enslaved women very often would spend the majority of their time working. Enslaved men, of course, would be doing work outside, right? Farm labor. One of the largest tasks they would be doing was clearing land. I'm going to go back one slide. I love this comparison. People are often surprised to hear that we have like 4 times, if not more, trees today than there were here in 1750 or 1800. Europeans go about clearing almost all land in Ulster and Orange County. Really, in Ulster County, it's just a few uplands in the Catskill Mountains and a bit of the Shandro Mountains that are not deforested. But most of our nature preserves, even in the area today, are second growth forests. Lake Minnewaska and Mohonk Preserve, much of that was a town that was cleared of land at one point, as shocking as that is. And so, one time when I was like 18, a tree fell, very short, I mean like this wide, I couldn't even call it a tree, it's a stretch, fell in my parents' driveway. And just being a farm kid, thinking about history, I decided I wanted to take my dad's hatchet and I wanted to try and break it myself. I ended that day with my hands bleeding with the worst blisters I've ever had in my entire life, and I didn't break through the damn thing. Imagine clearing that amount of land with your bare hands. I can't fathom it. I really cannot wrap my mind around it. But I hope that you're getting a sense not just of what this would be like in terms of daily life for the enslaved people, but the incredible impacts they're having on these communities. It's their skills and their intellect that's going into the design of the historic houses which still stand to this day. It's their hands which are committing the labor that builds the stone houses which still stand to this day. It's their labor which contributes to the wealth that allows for European families to establish themselves here, many of whom still have descendants here to the present day, and I'm a fantastic example of that. So I'm just going to go back a bit and keep talking through some more documents as well. This document shows us a bit of how enslaved people enter up here. There are auctions in almost every town here. They're required to have public government auctions. But they could sell anything. And most of what they're selling are not enslaved people. They could sell enslaved people, and they would, but they're not the most common things being sold. There is a trade of enslaved people, person to person, throughout what's now the state of New York. But many times people here, if they want an enslaved person, as towns are being founded here, there isn't enough trade of enslaved people here to support that. And so very often, if not most often, they're being brought up here from New York City. This is a translation. The original document we don't have surviving. But this is showing us how the first enslaved woman ends up in New Paltz, the first black resident of New Paltz, really. Her name is Betty. And if you see the translation, it says Peter Dale at New York, July 4th, 1694. Bit of irony on the date. Sir, if you are really desirous of having the negress, and that would be a word that's indicating this is a child of African descent. If you're really desiring of having her of whom you spoke to me, send 36 pistoles, it's a Portuguese coin, at the first opportunity. Otherwise, please let me know if you do not wish her, so that those to whom she now belongs may wait no longer. For as she is sold, they only await the pleasure of her delivery. I am your obedient servant, Charles, and his last name was Denasso or Denasso. What's happening here? What's Charles's role? Yeah, he's a middleman, he's a broker. Yeah. And so he's actually married to the first cousin of Peter Dale. Peter Dale writes to his cousin, his cousin's husband down in New York City and says, I'm looking to buy an enslaved person, can you find a suitable seller? And he arranges this sale so that the seller he's mentioning is a trafficker, a man named James Barre, who made his occupation by trafficking people from, not just from Africa, from West Africa, from West Central Africa. We had documentation of him in Madagascar, and that's a unique thing about New York. In the English colonies, it's pretty much exclusively West Africa, West Central Africa, and from the Caribbean up. In New York, they're colonizing Madagascar. So you have enslaved people of Malagasy descent that end up here. Oftentimes we have black Americans today with DNA tests that take a DNA test and find Malagasy and Polynesian ancestry, and it throws their identity for a loop. But that's just showing us that their ancestors would have came through New York specifically. So his name, the broker, was Charles Denasso. This translator couldn't work out his name. I know his name from another document. And I think the interesting thing, in the other document, so that we have a receipt showing this being carried out. In the other document, the payment given to the trafficker is 35 of these Portuguese. So Charles Denisso's role in this, he brokers the sale, he delivers Betty up to New Paltz, he gets 1 Portuguese coin as his fee. If you notice, this one says 36, and what's actually given to the trafficker is 35. So likely Charles Denisso pockets that one. This is just a quick document showing us one important thing for me to mention. So we don't have anywhere near as extensive records of Native people being enslaved in the Hudson Valley as we have African people. It was actually eventually illegal, explicitly illegal under Dutch and eventually English law to have Native people enslaved here, but it does happen. And it's not really being enforced by the Dutch or English governments. And so again, it's not the most common thing, but I wanted to mention it because it is something that happens. You will sometimes come across records of enslaved people that are of just Native descent or Native and African descent. When I say Native, I don't necessarily mean Lenape. This is one of the only other documents we have for that trafficker who sells Betty. James Barre is in New York City, and you can see the title is from the New York State Archive. Account of Native Americans sold as slaves, giving the names of the people sold and of the purchasers. Now, unfortunately, much to my frustration, the tear covers the last names of all the purchasers. So we can't hold them accountable. We only get names like Karsten, Dirk, Ever, this one is Mr. Jacob, there is a captain, and there's a colonel, I believe there, or a doctor as well. But then on the right side, you get the names of the enslaved people. And just to read some of them out loud, you have an Indian girl by the name Catalina, an Indian girl by the name Clara, an Indian man by the name Juan, an Indian woman by the name Maria, another one Diego, another one Clara. This is showing James Barre participating, and we have some other documents that contextualize this. He was one of a few participants. He's a privateer, we may call him a pirate. The Dutch and the Spanish are at war at this point. The Dutch are fighting for independence from Spain. They've just gained it. He is, with a mandate from the Dutch government, raiding settlements on the east coast of Mexico. He's taking enslaved native people from Mexico. He's bringing them back to New York, and this is the list of them being sold in New York. We also have record of him in Madagascar, and we have record of him in West Central Africa. So right, you get a broad diversity of enslaved people as well. Now combine that with the diversity of the Europeans I already mentioned, you get some insight into how New York becomes New York today, right? It's the most diverse place to ever exist in the history of of humanity, which is an incredible thing. I already talked about this one, I'm gonna keep moving forward. So just wanted to quickly mention, so we all tend to think stone houses when we think Dutch colonization in the area. Stone houses usually come second though. This is something that we're only really figuring out in the last 20, 30 years because of tree ring dating, dendrochronology. We can now tree ring date the beams and the woodwork in an old stone house. And what we find most often are that a lot of the woodwork is not from when the town was founded. For telling New Paltz, founded in 1677, 1678, we expected the stone houses to all come back from the decades after that. But almost always, all of these smaller beams come back from the early 1700s to mid-1700s, the second generation, whatever the second generation inherits the home. But we usually find the biggest beams. I mean, beams so big that you could not find trees that wide today. We find those dated to the 1680s, to the earliest years of a settlement. So they're most often living in wood houses, like the one you see on the left. This is a Dutch-style wood frame house. Or in what we call earth-fast houses. You dig out a cellar, you line that with boards, you build a small roof over that cellar. That's your shelter for the first couple of years before you can then afford to build a wooden house over top of that cellar hole, before then your kids can afford to build a permanent stone house on that site. And stone houses aren't just more permanent, they also indicate a bit of wealth as well. And that's why they'd be doing that. But again, you have enslaved people that would be living in the cellar spaces of these sorts of homes. And so we get the evolution of earth-fast to wooden houses to stone houses such as this. This is another painting by Len Tantillo showing what a Dutch village site here in the Hudson Valley might have looked like in the second generation. And you can see an enslaved woman in the foreground of this image. I'm going to talk about a couple more documents while I have time, but I am going to pause for questions. So these are documents just kind of illustrating some of the things I've talked about, but I wanted to show as many primary source examples as I could. So this on the left is a estate inventory. It's an inventory taken after a man named, I can't remember his first name, I should have wrote it down, I'm so sorry. But his last name is Jansen, I have his initials up there. After a man from Ulster County passes away without a will. They have to take a full inventory of his property. And you can see, listed alongside property like wheat, listed alongside property like a Bible. It's these documents that would have enslaved people listed as well. Now on this one specifically, you can see on the top right, Henry Danson, that was his name, came to me. You can see Frank, an old Negro, and under that, 2 spaces, Frank, a young Negro. There's an enslaved person under Frank, an old Negro named Trump. And that was actually a common name of enslaved people. I don't know what to make of that, but I'll leave you guys alone. Underneath Frank, a young Negro, you have Bell, and you have Dean as well. So again, showing us visually and really viscerally this dehumanization. Oh, sorry. Going over one, this is a will of a man named John Hasbrook. John Hasbrook lived, and up until like 6 years ago, I would have said he built this house and lived in on the right. This is a great example of the tree ring dating I just talked about. We did tree ring dating of this house maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, and we found the oldest parts of the building dated to 1680. All of the stonework and the wood built into the stonework is from 1721.
It's a Jacob Hasbrook house.
Yeah, that's what we call it now. Yeah.
They call it that 20-something years ago.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So it's because Jacob Hasbrook's the son of John Hasbrook who builds that stone house.
John is my ancestor.
Oh, cool. So we're long lost cousins then. That means.
Yeah.
And John Hasbrook, in his will of 1712, that you see in the center, he leaves that house, the wooden house, to his son. So his son Jacob ends up building a stone house. He He leaves two enslaved men named Garrett and James to his son as well. I'm not going to sidetrack myself now, but we're doing research right now on Garrett. He has an incredible kind of story where at one point a rumor arises among the Esopus that the Europeans are going to attack the native people of Ulster and Orange County. And they go to their allies at this point. They go to the Europeans and kicks, and they say, what the hell, basically? Like, why is everyone talking about you guys planning to attack us? We've been renewing this treaty for 75 years. And the Dutch say, or the people in Kingston say, we're not planning to, what are you talking about? So they investigate the rumor. And they eventually talk to a native boy that says, well, he was in New Paltz with his family, and while his parents were trading with Jacob Hasbrook, he was off on the side talking to Garrett. And Garrett's the one that told him, yeah, you better be careful, and start telling the rest of your community they're planning to attack him. And so we don't know entirely why. This research is underway, and I'm teasing it because this will be a presentation we'll give all around Ulster County next year, and maybe one I'd love to come back for in the future. But in that same will, John Hasbrook writes something that, I mean, I've talked about this specific example thousands of times. And I mean, I really struggle to wrap my mind around it. He leaves ownership of a enslaved, girl, she's like 15, to his daughter Elizabeth. But he specifies in the will that Elizabeth's first child, if she's to have children, is to be kept with her and is to be nursed by her until the age of 1, at which point the child is to be taken from her and given to Jacob as part of his inheritance instead. I'm a 27-year-old boy, right? I'm a 27-year-old man. I don't have kids. Many of you do. Really pause for a moment and think about what that would be like. Imagine your child when they were 1. Imagine your first birthday party you might have held for your child. And imagine the person that enslaves you taking that child from you on that first birthday. I've talked about this thousands of times. I'm no closer to understanding what that would have been like. Yeah,
Why
please.
would they want that child?
It's a great question. Because inheriting an enslaved person inherently means you just don't have to pay for them. And that child eventually would be labor that's profitable. But I'm glad you raised that, because that is something you see. One of the hardest things about researching enslavement for us in the present day, right, is that, I'm safe making this assumption with all of you, none of us think this way, right? None of us think of people as human property. None of us think as people as not humans. And so trying to understand a question like that, that's such a fantastic, and that's a question a historian would ask.
Well, because it says to me, why would they want the responsibility of raising that child from 1 to
Exactly.
12?
And it's challenging to kind of answer those questions because we all are going to struggle to put ourselves in the mindset of a slave owner, right? But yeah, go for it.
It's a future investment.
Exactly, is what it is.
You think of what life, 20th century life was like in the States before Social Security.
Yeah.
People had large families
Yeah.
because your children were going to support you.
Yeah.
And so they would have had passing on this young
Yeah.
slave, this enslaved person, as a future investment, that that person was going to provide labor and security for the other person
Yeah.
in their old age.
I love the example of families
They
too.
probably had no idea that
Yeah.
slavery would ever end.
And that's why it's 1. It's because she is left with her mother long enough to be nursed to the point that she can eat solid food.
Right, sure.
But then is taken because anywhere beyond that, you're requiring Elizabeth, the daughter, to pay for the cost of the investment that then Jacob, her brother, is going to get the profits from. I'll be quite honest with you, I feel uncomfortable even answering it, right? Like, it's an important question that I have to answer, but because this is why it's a challenge, because our minds don't want to think in these dehumanizing terms today.
Somebody has to raise that child.
Yeah, that would likely be another enslaved woman, yeah.
But if you're thinking in that vein about the child then being able to eat
Yeah,
adult food or a process of
Yeah.
adult food, that implication would mean that probably the wet nurses were also other enslaved.
oh, absolutely. The wet nurses, enslaved women.
Because you had to have wet nurses these
Yeah,
days.
one of their common tasks is nursing white children. Sojourner Truth, in the most comprehensive first-hand account we have of an enslaved person in the western Hudson Valley, she writes about the times in which she had to leave her kids hungry. She writes about the anguish she felt as her own newborn children are crying because she instead had to nurse the enslaver's children.
Which also meant that the enslaved woman had to be kept pregnant.
Yeah,
Because you only lactate after a baby
yeah.
is born.
And I am very close with both my sisters. They have had 5 kids in the last 6 years. And like, through that process, I've been blown away at how much it takes out of a person's body to nurse 1 kid. My oldest middle sister has twins, right? To nurse 2 children. let alone to be trying to nurse children of an enslaver at the same time you're trying to nurse your own. And we can see some of the spaces in which these activities would have taken place. Oh, sorry, too far. So this is images of 2 living quarters on Huguenot Street that thankfully are preserved. Most often the cellar kitchens no longer look like cellar kitchens. They get torn out and they get adapted into just normal cellars eventually. You might have a bit of a hearth space, but for the most part they don't survive. So the one on the left you see is from the Abraham Hasbrook house. It's the brother of John Hasbrook who I just talked about. And his cellar kitchen is incredibly preserved. But I would like to point out a few things with this. To give an idea of what the conditions would have been like. There were no floorboards originally. It was dirt floor. There is a large window right outside of the frame on the right-hand side here. I mean, like a large full-size window. That would not have been there. And so there's no natural light. You have a little bit. You can see there's one tiny little, very small window in the back corner, and that would have been the only natural light in that room. Again, a dirt floor. The walls are covered in a thick layer of whitewash now. They were not covered with so thick a layer originally. And so if it rained, it would have been muddy down there. In the winter, it would have been freezing and damp. In the summer, it would have been hot and dry. It would have been dark, with, only what light you have from the fire from the candles down there. There's a door that leads you from the upper part of the house down to the cellar now that was not originally. So an enslaved woman, after finishing cooking one of these meals, would have had to carry it outside through whatever the elements were outside, up around and into the family's house through a separate door, just to enforce the separation and remind them of this difference of status. You can see just how many objects are crammed in there for just how much work enslaved people would be doing. And they would be most likely sleeping in bedrolls on the ground. But we do have examples of enslaved people also living in attic spaces, what they would call garret. A garret is a livable attic. And so this is a garret space in the John Hasbrook house on the right side. It's possible that Molly, who I just talked about, that 15-year-old girl, it's possible that Molly, that mother, might have lived in this room you see on the right-hand side, and this one has no windows. But they would have had, and it's important to mention, small semblances of personal possessions as well. Sometimes even possessions that they bring with them when they come over. One thing I want to quickly show before I wrap up is this image on the right, because we don't have many photos of enslaved people that survived to us. And this is a photograph of a formerly enslaved woman named Julia Jackson, who lived in New Paltz. That picture is taken right in front of the Huguenot Reformed Church on Huguenot Street in New Paltz. You can see it in the background. She was born in the 1790s. She was actually given as a wedding present by white parents to their children. Was given as a wedding present, lived in New Paltz, working for that same family, but eventually just becoming an incredibly well-respected elder in the community. And actually, she lives long enough that some of the earliest historians of New Paltz get to interview her. And in the oldest history book we have on New Paltz, or it's kind of the seminal early one, the History of New Paltz, New York, and its old families, she's interviewed. And much of the best documents about the last native people present in the region come from her, which I think is incredible. I just want to fast forward quick to get to 2 more things. So I mentioned already that sometimes enslaved people are able to bring objects over with them. So little bits of agency, times when enslaved people could assert their own will over their own way of life, are extremely important, right? Because they are doing that, asserting their humanity throughout a process that denies it to them. You might be separated from your family, and that's something I should mention is inherent to enslavement here. If every enslaver owns 1 to 3 enslaved people, how many families are going to be 1 to 3 people? If a family is more than 3 people, chances are they were separated. And so you might be sent to a general store down the road by your enslaver. And you might have 2 hours to go to that general store, like 3 miles away, and come back. But you might know that your sister was sold, right, like a quarter mile off the path to that general store. And you might sneak off and go visit her and then come back, right? So there's small ways you can assert this agency. These are 2 artifacts we have in New Paltz. The one in the middle is a string of blue glass trade beads of cowrie shells, and now there's a Dutch trade bell on the end. Honestly, I hate that I took this picture this way because you can't see the bell. But this was found a few years ago when we took apart a window frame in the John Hasbrook house, and this fell out from behind the window frame. It had been there since the 1700s. This is an object, which we have tons of examples of this. These are objects traded to Africans by Europeans for all manner of things. Could have been enslaved people, could have been anything else. But eventually it makes its way over here in the hands of an enslaved person. Based on the cowrie shells and their spiritual use by African women, most likely by a woman. And it gets hidden in the window frame of the John Hasbrook house. So just to think about what that meant for her. Yeah, and then we uncover it. So just think about what that would have meant for her. That one object from her homeland, maybe that one object from her family. On the right-hand side, probably the most visceral, and I'll be transparent with you all, the most triggering thing I'm going to talk about. This is a exact replica of a slave collar that was donated to the Huguenot Historical Society about 8 years ago. This was passed down through a white family in New Paltz from the 1700s to the present day. It is an iron chain with a key lock on the back. Based on the diameter matches the smallest size of the necklaces sold by Tiffany in their women's lines today, so most likely would have been a collar forced upon an enslaved woman. It has the name written in calligraphy on the top of it of the family that owns her, Hardenberg. And this is not just a visceral demonstration of the dehumanization of enslavement. The harder thing to see is that this is a demonstration of the agency and resistance of enslaved people. Because you're not going to need a collar most times, right? That's part of why this is a racialized system. A skin color is your collar in a sense, right? And a horrifying thing we don't talk about often enough, white people had a right to demand of any person of color in the public space to know if they had a right to be there. You could demand a pass. They would have had to show you a pass from their enslavers saying they had a right to be going wherever they were going. You don't need a collar, right?
They do like tattooing.
They would do sometimes branding and tattooing as well,
markings.
yeah. And so this collar, we only see collars pop up, and this is work actually that our town historian in New Paltz, Susan Stetson, did. She has a database she's made and a book of run advertisements for escaped enslaved people. And you only see collars mentioned in advertisements that mention a person who has already tried to escape multiple times. So, right, a woman might try and escape twice, and the third time when she comes back, they fit this on her as a kind of, last-ditch effort to try and discourage her, almost like a psychological tool. But I want to talk about one last thing quickly. Sorry, I know we're a little bit off on time, but. So, I want to just briefly touch on how enslavement ends here in New York. Because by the 1790s, much of New York is against the system. Most of the Northeast is morally against the system. And especially the English-speaking parts of the state of New York are very much against this by the 1790s. And it tends to be the oldest parts of the state, the parts that are still culturally Dutch, that are holding on to this system. And so, as they're trying to negotiate for the end of enslavement in the New York State government, they're trying to get these Dutch landowners to acquiesce, and they're fighting back saying, you're taking away our property and you're going to financially ruin us. And so, it ends gradually in what is, I think, best described as a series of compromises in order to get those slave owners to acquiesce. And so in 1799, they pass a law that mandates that any person born to an enslaved mother after July 4th, 1799 would be born legally, technically free, but they call them indentured. They specify it's not the same as the indentured, like European indentured servants. They say that they are required, they're essentially enslaved to their mother's enslaver till the age of 25 for a woman or 28 for a man. They also require all of those children to be recorded by the town overseers of the poor. And there is actually a mechanism by which they could be abandoned to the care of the town.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and that's why this is all also research that people like Mary Ellen has done, that people like Susan Stetson and New Paltz have done. Your fantastic little team have done just such great work. I'm really using a lot of your research here. So this is
Well, this is Ashley and Susan.
Yeah, this is Susan, heck yeah. And Ashley. So this is a register of enslaved people born in New Paltz and that are abandoned to the care of the town. But eventually they realized that enslavers are taking advantage of that system. They're abandoning enslaved people to the care of the town, and then those enslaved people are rented back out by the town, those children. And so those enslavers are giving up care of the child. I no longer have to pay for maintenance of this child, but then the town will pay me to take the kid back and have him work for me. What a brilliant system.
Oh yeah, they were getting reimbursed.
Yeah, and it does what the state needs it to do, which is to incentivize the abandonment of the enslaved children, but
It didn't do that at all.
it doesn't, well, it ends up not actually functionally doing that, yeah.
So 1848.
So they switched the laws, yeah,
1848
exactly.
is the last verse.
So they switched the laws basically to say that, and this is like after a series of laws, I'm just going to summarize them all so we can wrap up. If you're born before July 4th, 1827, regardless of when, you would, to an enslaved mother, it didn't matter who your father was, status was inherited through the mother, you would be freed on July 4th, 1827. Now if you were born to an enslaved mother between, and enslaved or indentured in this case, between 1799 and 1817, March of 1817, you would be enslaved to the age of 25 for a woman, 28 for a man. And now if either that person who's indentured or the enslaved person born before 1799, if they had a child between 1817 and July 4th, 1827, that child was required to serve their mother's enslaver until the age of 21, which could be as late as 1848. And so an example quickly, and this will be the last thing I share, there's a woman named Jane Deo in New Paltz that we've done extensive research on. Her mother, Elizabeth Du Bois, was born somewhere around 1780. And so she ends up being freed at the age of 47 in 1847. Now she has a daughter in 1803, and that's Jane. Jane takes on the name Deo. So Jane is freed in 1828 at the age of 25. Jane has a child. This breaks my heart every time I say it. We have a photo of him, though, God bless him. This is John Wynkoop. John Wynkoop was born on June 30th, 1827 to Jane Deo. He was born 5 days too early. I was due on July 4th. I ended up being born on July 13th. Many of you likely were born on a different due date than when you were due, or born on a different date than when you were due. He was required to serve his mother's enslaver for 21 years until the year 1848 because of that. And the last thing I want to leave us with, and just a sense of why this is, important. And really, sometimes I'll have people kind of raise, well, by the time of the Civil War, we're on the right side, right? Like, doesn't that kind of change things? But think about the year 1848. If you were old enough to enlist in the Union Army at the start of the Civil War, you inherently were old enough to have lived in New York when there were slaves in New York. Every Union soldier that was of age that legally enlisted in the Union Army from New York State was alive in New York State when there were slaves here still. So they're not fighting to end a system they didn't take part in. They're fighting to end a system that thankfully they had just ended not long before. And those enslaved families most often at first are working for the families that previously enslaved them. This in the middle is a woman named Margaret Clow Hasbrook. Her dad was from this generation that's freed. She is shown holding a child named Jesse Du Bois, who, actually his daughter still, I know his daughter, I know the daughter of the baby in this picture. It's horrifying, right? So this is the daughter of an enslaved person holding a child whose child I know. This is not long ago. So she worked for the same family that enslaved her parents. And that happens for a few generations. And almost all of our local rural towns would have historically black neighborhoods, in which eventually those families began asserting their own agency, supporting themselves. And so you have places like Mulberry Street in New Paltz as a historic black neighborhood. Let me think of a town on the town line. Marlborough is a great example. Many of you have been to Marlborough, right? It's like on the border between Orange and Ulster. Marlborough, what we now call South Street, is called Africa Lane. There's a historic free black neighborhood there. There would have been one in Goshen. There would have been one,
In the village of Montgomery.
I was about to look at you a minute. Give us an example.
Buffalo Hill.
Oh, wow.
And they had this Oakley Street.
Yeah.
Had an AME church.
Oh, cool. Yeah, and so they formed their own churches. And eventually, in the late 1800s, both because the economy's changing and the agricultural pursuits in these rural towns are fading away and the jobs are now available in industries in the local cities,
I think people
and
moved.
because, people from the South are moving to the local cities and other black people are moving to the cities. You want to be among a community of your own. We see the descendants of the enslaved people most often living in places like Middletown, Poughkeepsie, Newburgh, Yonkers, New York City.
I think Newark, New Jersey.
Newark is another huge one. Camden, Newark are both huge ones. And so, for example, John Hasbrook, I know his grandkids. They grew up in Yonkers, and I'm blessed to still know them. His daughter actually is a pretty prominent lawyer up in Coxsackie, up in Greene County today. Another family we know of descendants in New Paltz, their descendants end up in Kingston. But likely you all have come across this before. Think of a person of color that you know with a last name that starts with Von something. Think of a person of color you know with a last name like Hasbrook, or Du Bois, or Deo. And these are people that still to this day hold a name that demonstrates that their ancestors not just endured this awful system, but endured this awful system while, being integral to the founding, to the establishment, and to the evolution of the towns that we all live in. And then play an integral role in building the homes that we all have today. And so, again, I just want to thank you all from the bottom of my heart, not just because I'm sure you can all tell how much I enjoy this. I just think history is fascinating. I could talk about this for 5 hours. But also because, it's especially rewarding for me to get to tell a story that I think is a meaningful contribution to the history of a community, of a region I've lived in my entire life, in which my family's lived in since 1660. But especially I want to thank you all because just by coming to this, you're contributing to a deeper understanding for everyone of our common history. And it's just by coming here, your guys' contribution to undoing a historical wrong, which was us not talking about this. The last point I'll leave you with, I just gave a presentation last night, for example, on Jack and Betty, the first black residents of New Paltz. The Huguenot Historical Society was founded in 1894. They've had those documents since 1894. It was not until 2024 that they had a dedicated program or lecture talking about the first black residents of New Paltz. So that's why this is so important. So again, I'm happy to take as many questions as people have, but just want to say thank you again from the bottom of my heart. Don't want to hang around for questions. I do have business cards, and I'm in Orange County, so I have to be careful saying this, but usually I would say I work for all of you. But even still, if you have a research question, my job is to answer it. I'm a research librarian in a lot of the sense. So I have business cards, I'm happy to give them out. If anyone doesn't want to stick around and wants to email me a question instead.
Okay, so just one point. We are going to do questions. We
Yeah.
have about 10 minutes. There's another program coming into
Yeah.
this room, right, following, and we have to clear and get everything reset. So, sorry, but
Yeah, so
only
we want
about
to
10
be leaving at
The
11:40.
next
Yeah.
train.
By 11:40, I should
Yep.
say. Go for it.
The founder of the NAACP was W.E.B. Du Bois, who I think grew up in the Albany area, but he was obviously connected to the Dutch.
Yeah. So he actually is a direct descendant. He's not, so many black families end up just being assigned the last name of the family that enslaved them. But, and I didn't mention this, but it's important to mention, some people likely have assumed this, but being the distribution of enslaved people I mentioned, being the way they're living in these cellar spaces, being that status is passed through the woman, there's rampant sexual violence committed among enslaved men here. And I'm not going to go into any more than that because of trauma and triggering, but we do see people that are the direct descendants of European enslavers and enslaved women. W.E.B. Du Bois is an example of this. W.E.B. Du Bois's grandfather was the child of a Du Bois family member in Poughkeepsie, or a Du Bois family member and his enslaved person. If you trace his family back, he's descended from Louis Du Bois, the founder of New Paltz, his brother Andres Du Bois, who lived in Poughkeepsie. So I mean, he's the grandchild of a slave owner and enslaved woman. And goes on to become the founder of the NAACP. Really quick aside, he actually is trying to document his own family history at one point in his life, and he writes, one of his friends writes to him and says, hey, I was just traveling with a girl I'm courting, we went through this little town upstate New York called New Paltz, and we found these really old houses with your last name on them, dude, you gotta go check this out. And he writes to the families in New Paltz, he uses a fake name, and he says, this is, I'm descendant, and he only gives the name of the enslaver grandfather. And he says, yeah, I'm this guy's grandson. And they're like, no way. And they write him his full family tree. And he doesn't tell them that he's the child of that man and an enslaved woman. And then he goes and visits New Paltz. We only know about it because about 10 years after he visited, he gives a speech where he describes visiting Huguenot Street. But he used a fake name, and he says that he had to kind of conceal his identity because he was already promised. So we have no idea when he goes to Huguenot Street or who he talked to, but he went and he visited his family's ancestral homes there, yeah. Go for it.
For Orange County, people can go to the Orange County Genealogical Society.
Yeah,
And Bob
absolutely.
Brennan did, I think, 4 volumes on the black families
Mhm.
in Orange County. And he did do some of Northern, he had some Montgomery people in there. So that's the Orange County, and then you can also mention
There's a book that just came out, Bearing Witness. I would especially recommend 2 books called In Defiance. There's a volume 1, volume 2, that are a compilation of all freedom seeker advertisements written by the New Paltz County historian Susan Stetson and her close collaborator Ashley Biagini. And it's compiling freedom seeker advertisements, ads for runaway enslaved people or escaped enslaved people all throughout the Hudson Valley, including here.
Well, and for Orange County, Sal Laguna in Goshen.
And they're incredible because those advertisements, remember I mentioned the records are going to be dehumanizing. But an advertisement that uses the language I showed you, right? Escaped from me, like Negro woman.
But
That advertisement's not going to be all that effective. So the advertisements will say stuff like, escape from me.
purple dress.
Yeah.
But that's the only way we get a visualization
Exactly.
of who these people are.
And I'm so glad you brought that up because I
And
would have
that's
forgot to mention
the
that.
thing that I gave out was written by Ashley.
Awesome. So you'll be able to see from that document that Mary Ellen handed out, things like escaped enslaved man. His name was Jack.
Yeah.
He's Senegalese.
Right.
He speaks these 3 cultural languages from Senegal and speaks broken Dutch. He has ritual scarring on his face. He's wearing a red coat. He smoked tobacco and he was a fantastic singer. Like, you get insight into their lives in a way you will not get anywhere else.
Right.
It's fantastic. Thank you for bringing that up because I would have been angry at myself driving home when I realized I didn't mention that. Yeah, go for it.
On the slide with Miss Jackson and then a listing on the side
Yeah.
of slave owners, there was the name Hardenberg.
Yes.
And he had more slaves than anybody else on the
Yeah,
list.
Yeah.
Was that the Hardenberg of the Hardenberg patent?
Same family, different branch, different member of the
Because I'm
family.
like, he would
Yeah.
have needed a lot.
The
more
Hardenbergs are all over the
slaves
place.
For that, okay.
The Hardenbergs are also, so remember I said also it's a different Hardenberg. Elias Hardenberg is the one who owned the collar.
Yes.
Sojourner Truth's enslaver was the first cousin of Elias Hardenberg. That's Charles and, I can't remember Charles' father's name. Johannes? Cornelius Hardenberg. So yeah, the Hardenbergs are a large family. And actually we see sometimes those families get kind of distinguished in their own time period. There's a family in New Paltz, the Weinkoop family, or one man, Dirk Weinkoop, Jordan Waiku owned at one point 19 enslaved people, and the next largest enslaver owns like 11 people. And the men and women live in separate buildings. He grows exclusively wheat, and they work sun up to sundown in those wheat fields, including the children. And we're seeing other enslavers who are committing their own atrocities, right? But they refer to him, and they're like, yeah, but that guy's a plantation owner. Yeah, and they call him a plantation owner, and they differentiate with that person. I would say neither one's better or worse, obviously, right? But it's interesting to see that different implementation.
Actually, the next line of research that's been harder to do is to find people who did serve during the Revolutionary
Oh my
War
gosh, I
and
know.
got their freedom.
I know.
I mean, we found one in New Windsor.
Yeah.
Danforth.
It's really easy to find them behind the British side. Finding them on the American side is a little more difficult, but we have them in muster rolls sometimes. Yeah, go find them.
I recall, I'm not sure I'm correct, but there was a referendum in New York State that connected with ending slavery in the state.
Oh, I don't
And
know that.
my recollection is that Rockland County, which I think might have been larger at that time, voted against ending slavery.
Yeah, Ulster County does
Dutch
too.
influence.
Yeah, Ulster County does too. I'm not sure about Orange, how they vote on the gradual emancipation laws, but Ulster County votes against it. Showing us the cultural divide between the Dutch and the English. One of I think he's from Rochester, I want to say, which is like a hotbed of liberalism in this day, in the 1800s. But there's a man from Rochester who's in the state Senate, I want to say, it might be the Assembly. But in commenting on this, there's a quote that survives in a newspaper in which he says, in the referendum and in the debate over this law, he says the Dutch senators swore by Dunder and Blitzen that we were robbing them of their property. Like, you can hear him stereotyping and kind of being denigrating to the culturally Dutch people there, saying like these backwards Dutch folks in the colony or in the state. Yeah.
Interestingly, then when the Germans came in, the
Yeah.
Palatines, they really became enslavers big time.
Which is odd because they have the closest relations with the native people all the time. So it's fascinating. Like, you can see a completely different relationship they have with native
What was odd
people.
was that they were under serfdom in the Palatinate.
Yeah. This document on the left, I'll just quickly mention. This was found by our town historian, Susan Stesson. This is a complaint. It's in Dutch, so don't worry too much about trying to read it. But it's a complaint written to the English governor in 1712, mentioned by the government of Ulster County, specifically mentioning a couple of people in New Paltz, that says that they have had so many enslaved men escape and marry into the Munsee community in Minnesink
Yes.
that they are requesting the English government for them to be welcomed in there, marrying in.
Minnesink.
Yeah.
Which Minnesink? Minnesink is Minnesink, New Jersey.
So I'm referring to it historically. So it would refer to, in general, just the region of, it would include everything from here down through northern New Jersey.
New Jersey
Yeah, so
and
they,
Pennsylvania.
I guess maybe not so much here, but the upper Delaware River Valley. So yeah, it could have been anywhere around
That's my
there.
area.
Oh, cool. So yeah, it could have been anywhere around there. But I mean, they complained to the English governor there must have been that many people escaping there and marrying into the community. So you see native people assist oftentimes European, or the
What year was
enslaved
that?
people. 1712, I think it was.
Okay, because don't forget too, that John Evans patent wasn't settled by colonial.
Yeah, so there are no
until
Europeans down there.
1719.
Yeah.
So we don't really know on this huge acreage.
It could be
from
anywhere.
Hudson all the way over. Obviously, tribal people were still living here.
Yeah, yeah.
Until they were forced west.
If anyone's interested, I'll just quickly mention it. But so I mentioned the last treaty renewal with the Esopus happens in 1776. In the lead up to the Revolution, they've been pushed way into the southwestern part of Ulster County there, or southwest. Yeah, they're way out in like Neversink area. Yeah, and Mavacating as well. And they commit to the British side. They're being pushed closer and closer to the British side overall, and allying with the Haudenosaunee, but they're still keeping up their alliance with just Ulster County, right? So they are building an antagonistic relationship in New York State with America, but they maintain the alliance with Ulster County. And even after they commit to the British side in 76, they still do one last treaty renewal with the government in Kingston. But then they do something that they can't take back. They fight in the Battle of Oriskany upstate, or they end up actually fighting on the British side, and they come across some Ulster County militiamen there, and Orange County militiamen as well, and we lose.
Yeah.
And they write to George Clinton, our local colonial leader, right? And they write to him and they ask to renew the treaty again in 1777, and George Clinton writes back and says, I know you were at Oriskany, you made your bed, you're gonna lay in it. And that's the last time there was ever a treaty renewal. They eventually, by the Revolution, get forced over the border to Ontario, Canada, and they remain there today, ever since what happens in the Revolution. And just a cool thing to mention as we wrap up, I have the great privilege tomorrow of flying to Ontario. So I'm going to visit those 2 tribal reservations tomorrow, actually, for a couple of days. So I should have more exciting stuff to report back on in the future. So yeah, I know we have to start wrapping up. So if anybody still has a question I didn't get to, feel